So this is M61, which is the conservation of biodiversity. So basically there's two approaches to conservation. There's looking at single species, so that would be just preserving the single species without looking at the ecosystem, or without looking at how it fits into the ecosystem and maybe preserving the entire ecosystem. And then the second is the ecosystem itself, so preserving the entire ecosystem with all of the other species intact with it. So that would be having to obviously set aside some land for the organism. So one of the acts that was first not first put in, but one of the acts more recently that was put into place was the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So make sure you understand that, understand the legislation behind it and what it protects. So looking at the idea behind endangered or threatened species. So the U.S. uses a little bit of a different protocol or terminology than the world does. So endangered is threatened. So this is U.S. terms. So endangered is threatened, whereas threatened would be near threatened as far as the international terms go. So yesterday when we talked about threatened, near threatened, extinct, least concern, those kinds of things. So endangered for the U.S. would mean threatened. And then threatened is near threatened, meaning that it may be threatened in the future. So who manages this is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So they oversee the Endangered Species Act, which helps to protect animals that are threatened. And then looking at that list, plants make up the majority of the species. So they have the most species listed on there as endangered, which is kind of surprising because we don't talk a lot about plants. We talk a lot about animals more than we do plants. But plants make up the most out of all of those organisms, about 947 is what the book said. And then in order to kind of combat endangered species, so this would be kind of at the species level. So looking at the California condor, for example, this was almost extinct. So this animal was on the brink of extinction, but captive breeding has really extremely helped out these numbers where it's not even on the endangered species list anymore. I believe it's still near threatened, but it's not on the endangered list anymore. So that was due to captive breeding and release into the wild. And then there's reintroduction. So a great example of that is the gray wolf, which was reintroduced into Yellowstone, and now the gray wolf has spread over to Oregon and into California. So it's kind of exciting. Something else that you need to be familiar with is the spotted owl. So the spotted owl, there's a huge controversy. This was when I was in high school. Huge controversy on the spotted owl. So in the Pacific Northwest, there's lots of old growth forest. And with the spotted owl, the lumber companies wanted to go in and they wanted to harvest that old growth forest for the wood that was there for whatever reason. And so the spotted owl, this is their only habitat. They have to have old growth forest. So it's not just any forest, but it's old growth forest for their nesting. And so they went back and forth, huge controversy. People sat up in trees and all kinds of stuff for it. But they ended up compromising. And so the lumber companies are able to go in and kind of selectively harvest some of the trees in certain areas, and then certain areas are protected. So they were able to kind of conserve that. So the spotted owl example, that would be kind of an ecosystem. So we preserve the ecosystem because the spotted owl can't live without the ecosystem, but the condor would be an example of a single species. So we didn't preserve the entire area that the condor lives. We just captive bred and then reintroduced. And then as far as this convention, so lots of laws we're getting into and acts in these last few chapters, but Convention of Biological Diversity, there's three things that this entails. So conserve biodiversity, sustainably use the resources that are available, and then equitably share the benefits. So whether that would be medicine, food, lumber, whatever there is in there, we would share. So this is looking at both intrinsic and instrumental value, which is really nice because it focuses on both. And then So genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem services, these are all going down. So that's kind of the downside, I guess, to, not downside, but kind of the bummer part about this section. And looking at the conservation, the Convention of Biological Diversity, is that what they found after looking at this, looking at both intrinsic and instrument of value, is that all of these things, these three factors that we look at for biodiversity, are all going down. So, so meaning that it's getting worse, I guess. So that's kind of a downfall, but there's hope. There's definitely, it's not a dismal situation. So, lots of people doing lots of things to increase that. And this just brings awareness. So it's good that we see this and we can bring awareness to this and do something about it. So for conserving biodiversity and conserving habitats, these three things are really important. So size, shape, and connectedness of the protected areas, those are really, really important. And I kind of will talk about that in just a minute. So basically the size, how big is the area? So big versus small, there's benefits to both actually and downfalls to both. The shape, so it's not just one big circle, but maybe it incorporates all the different areas that the species need to go in winter versus summer. So shape does matter. And then how are they connected? So lots of organisms migrate. So are they able to migrate if we preserve just one big area? Or do we do many smaller areas that are maybe semi-connected? So that's really important, all these factors. So if we think back to the theory of island biogeography, so you did a lab on this or an activity that you had different circles of islands and you had beads that you dropped onto the paper and they spread out. And so what you found was the bigger islands, they contain more biodiversity. So they just have more room, more space. And then also if they're close to the mainland. So organisms migrate from the mainland onto islands. So if the island is really super remote and far away, it's only going to be the organisms that can swim far or fly far. Otherwise, and so that's going to mean that the diversity there is going to be a little bit smaller. And then the closer it is to the mainland, the bigger the diversity. So that's the theory of island biogeography. The closer it is to the mainland, the more diverse. The bigger the island, the more diverse. So this applies to islands, of course, but it also applies to these isolated inland islands. So what I mean by that is there's little separated areas. So let's say that we have lots of development, and there's little protected parks here and there. Well, those in a way are kind of inland islands. They're little islands, little nature preserves, little parks. How well are the organisms able to move about inside there? So if we have a big, let's say we have Redding, for example, lots of forests around us, so lots of organisms. Well, how big are our parks within Redding? Are the organisms that live outside of Redding, are they able to easily find their way to each individual park within the city? If you're looking at like an example like Central Park in New York, that island or that area is pretty isolated and surrounded by lots of buildings. So that is a, it's big though, so they have that going for them. But, if something happens, disease or something like that, their diversities are going to drop. Because organisms can't just readily go into the park from the outskirts of New York City. So that would be an example of this. Luckily, it's big, and there is quite a bit of diversity because it is large, but it's very isolated. And so that's how size, shape, and connectedness kind of factor in. And then habitat corridors, those are to connect them. So if we have smaller, thinking about Redding again, if we have smaller little parks within Redding, the organisms are able to move about into those habitats within the city easier. So the corridors would be maybe green belts that they can move between each of the kind of designated areas. So that's what a habitat corridor is. And then if we look up here, this is really promising. So changes in protected land. So notice how this is looking at land and ocean. And notice how they are growing. So from 1960 to 2010, if we look at land, it's growing kind of at a steady rate as far as protected land. And then if we look at marine area or ocean area, it's kind of steady up until 2000, a little bit, maybe 2005, and then it's pretty much just shot right up. And that's due to what we talked about in the last section as far as protecting marine life and understanding the diversity and the importance of marine life. So that's happy news. And then this is kind of the question down here. So here's New York with Central Park. But here's the question: protect single large area or many small? So what do you do? So if we have a single large area like Central Park, well, there's lots of biodiversity within the park, but if something happens like disease, then what do we do? How do we make that more diverse so that organisms aren't able to just kind of travel over to the city or travel over to the park from the city? And then also we look at edge habitat, and I'll kind of mention this a little bit more later, but edge habitat is the edge of the park. So the edge of the park, those organisms that live there, they interact with humans often. The organisms that live in the park don't necessarily, unless people venture into the park. So edge habitat is really important. How much edge habitat do we have? That would be like looking at surface area. So the more edge habitat we have, the more potential for organisms, humans, to interact with those organisms. So that would be how shape is important. And then looking at this, this is showing biosphere reserves. So this is kind of an idea of preserving areas for multiple different uses. So you can see there's the core zone, buffer zone, transition area. So the core zone basically is an area where there's very limited human activity. So humans really, unless they're remotely backpacking, there's no travel, no roads. It would be hiking only. So Glacier National Park is a great example of this. And then they've got a buffer zone. So looking at the buffer zone here. So this is an area where humans, they might have trails, they might have maybe off-road, camping, recreation, that kind of stuff. So people are able to more readily go into there. And then we've got the transition area where we have people living, logging, farming. So this is just an example of what a biosphere reserve is. And we've got several of these, actually a lot of them throughout the U.S. and throughout the world. And so this is helping to preserve, so biodiversity in this case would be really high in the core zone. Biodiversity may be a little bit less or, similar to the core out here in the buffer zone. And then transition zone, we have less biodiversity because humans are able to use that more. So UNESCO is basically who came up with this, or who monitors the biosphere reserves. So it's shared use, and just kind of, this is just a summary of what I said. But the central core is limited human use, most diverse area. Buffer zone is where we have recreation. And then transition is where we can live, we can log, there's heavy use. So we would see the least amount of biodiversity here. And then the last part, the most diverse areas are in developing nations. So this is one of the reasons why there's a big push for educating people on sustainable farming, because there's a lot of forests being cut down every day for unsustainable farming. And it's not that the people want to ruin the environment, they just don't understand. So part of the Opal trip I did to Honduras and the Fiji one is basically educating the people on why their forest is important. So Fiji, we're trying to establish the first national park, so a biosphere reserve, basically. And they have some non-native species of mice that are kind of migrating into this natural preserve area, and they've come to Fiji on ships, just like they have pretty much everywhere else. And there are no predators, and so the reptiles, the species, insects and stuff that they have there are greatly diminishing because of these invasive species. And so basically they're, that's one example there. But we've got farming, we've got all kinds of things that we're trying to educate the people there about in order to help preserve their land and help preserve biodiversity and teach them the importance of it. And so, so those are developing nations. A lot of those are developing nations that have the most diverse areas because they live along the equator, which we have our rainforests, which are pretty diverse. And that's it for Module 61.